Welcome to Film and Page. I'm Dominic, and in this video I'm going to be discussing and reviewing the 2021 film Spider-Man No Way Home, starring Tom Holland as Spider-Man Peter Parker, Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange, Zendaya as MJ, Jacob Batalon as Ned Leeds, Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan, and Marissa Tomei as May Parker, with many more, directed by John Watts. So now I'll talk about the setup of the film, and then I'll go into my background with the character, and then I'll give a brief spoiler-free review of the movie before I start getting into the more details and more spoiler-heavy stuff. So this movie picks up directly where the last Spider-Man movie, Far From Home, left off. So now if you haven't seen Far From Home, spoiler warning, I'm going to spoil the end of that movie right now. So in the end of Spider-Man Far From Home, Peter Parker's identity is given away. The whole world learns that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Not only that, he is blamed with the murder of Mysterio. Now that's exactly where this film picks up. So now we're dealing with the fallout of what happened in the last movie. So everybody knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And it starts to really turn his life upside down. And the public opinion of Spider-Man is split in this movie. So you have one group that thinks he's a murderer for killing Mysterio and blames him for the death of Mysterio, and then there's another group that thinks he's a hero. And so he tries to somehow live with this, but it's not easy. Not only that, is everyone knowing that Peter Parker is Spider-Man is starting to impact the people around him in very negative ways, like his Aunt May, his girlfriend MJ, and his best friend Ned Leeds. So he doesn't know what to do about this, and so he decides to seek out the help of Doctor Strange. So he tracks down Doctor Strange and he asks him, is there anything you can do to make it so like it was before, that nobody knew that I was Peter Parker, or nobody knew that Peter Parker was Spider-Man? So Doctor Strange agrees to help him and create a spell that will make everyone forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. But now Peter Parker realizes the drawback to that. He still wants certain people to remember he is Spider-Man, like his girlfriend MJ, his best friend, and his aunt, and Happy. So, because of that, he keeps asking Doctor Strange to keep changing the spell while he's trying to cast the spell in mid-spell. So then that kind of like screws up the spell and unleashes a lot of a bad fallout from that. And that's really where the story takes off from there. So that's the setup for the movie. So now my background with the character. So when I was a kid, there was a point in my childhood where Spider-Man was my favorite superhero for a while. I collected the Spider-Man comics, and I watched that old 60s Spider-Man cartoon religiously. That was like my favorite version of Spider-Man. My favorite Spider-Man thing for a long time was that 60s cartoon. And, I collected right up until the point that I really discovered Batman. Then Batman became my number one favorite superhero, and he's been in that ranking ever since. But I still really enjoyed a lot of Spider-Man storylines and stuff over the years. I collected the Venom stuff, the Carnage stuff, and then, I really kind of fell off the Spider-Man wagon big time was with the Clone Saga storyline. And I tried again to get back into collecting Spider-Man monthly with, I think it was in the mid-2000s there. And unfortunately, the storyline that I started collecting on was a storyline where Gwen had, in the past, cheated on Peter Parker with Norman Osborn. Then she had twins for Norman Osborn that nobody knew about. Then the twins came back to try to find... it was a terrible storyline. Collected, and I just gave up after that. But, and the other thing, I always enjoyed the Spider-Man movies as well. I really liked the Tobey Maguire ones. And my favorite Spider-Man films are a mix between the Tom Holland Spider-Man films and the Tobey Maguire ones, with Andrew Garfield ones coming in dead last. They're my least favorite Spider-Man movies that are out there. And I'll talk in more detail about that later on. So that's my background with the character. So as far as spoiler-free review goes, this is probably one of the best MCU movies I've seen. It would probably be in my top 10 or top 5 even of all the MCU movies I've watched over the years. This was like a really fun movie. That's the only way I can describe it. The last one I seen that was really fun like this was Guardians of the Galaxy. And it was just a fun escapist movie. If you're looking for 2 hours of escapism, This is it. It's just a really fun movie. Now, it has its heavy moments in the movie, but overall, it's a really great film, and it's got a really good storyline. So if you're like a Spider-Man fan, this is like a must-see. You have to see this one. Or even just an MCU fan. I think most MCU fans are really going to like this movie. So that's my spoiler-free review. Just go see it. It's really good. So now I'm going to talk into more details. So spoiler warning, I'm going to get into more details about this movie. So now I want to talk about some of the things I didn't like about the past Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. So now I'm going to be talking about those movies because there's a thing with those past movies that gets fixed in this film. And then some other things there's another aspect of those Tom Holland Spider-Man movies that gets fixed in this movie as well, that other fans had a problem with, but me personally, I didn't. So I'll talk about that too. So now, what I didn't like about the first Tom Holland Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Homecoming, was I couldn't stand the character of MJ. I really did not like that character. I didn't like the way the character was written. The character was written to be really, it's almost like they went out of their way to make that character unlikable. So I never really understood the logic behind how they wrote that character. The character came off as just cold, mean, and really self-righteous. And to the point where you couldn't really see what Peter Parker would see in her at all. It was really strange. Now, they kind of like pedaled back on that a little bit with Spider-Man Far From Home. I liked the character a little bit more in that one. But still, some of the past elements were still like hanging on to that character. But in this movie, the character is completely fixed for me. This is how the character should have been portrayed from the start. Zendaya did a fantastic job as MJ. It's almost like a totally different character, to be honest. It's like a brand new MJ. And it just goes to show what the actor can do when they're given the proper stuff to work with. So her and Tom Holland, they had chemistry in this movie, and she was just a really likable character. She wasn't like a self-righteous character. She didn't come off as mean or cold or anything like that, like she did in the first Tom Holland Spider-Man movie, Homecoming. So the character, that's one thing I liked about this movie. It totally fixed the character of MJ. So that was a fantastic job. Now, one of the other things that other people thought was a problem with those other Spider-Man movies, MCU ones, that gets fixed in this one, but it was something that I myself didn't see as a problem. Now, one of the complaints I heard a lot about the first two Tom Holland Spider-Man films was that they didn't feel like Spider-Man films, because Spider-Man was too intertwined with the rest of the MCU. So you had Tony Stark played too big of a role in the first one, and then Spider-Man relies too much on Tony Stark's tech in those movies, and it's almost like he's more like the Iron Spider, or too much like they're grooming him to be the next Tony Stark or something like that, which a lot of people didn't like. Now, and they said they didn't really feel like Spider-Man movies, which I never really understood that complaint. For me, they did feel like Spider-Man films. Even though I did have problems with them, they still felt like actual Spider-Man movies. And that for me, I never had a problem with that, because it makes sense in the world that this Spider-Man exists in. And it goes along with what happens in the comic books. So in the comic books, Spider-Man is really intertwined with the rest of the Marvel Universe. He's always crossing over with Iron Man, the Avengers. He was even a part of the Avengers, and he's even taken advantage of Tony Stark's technology to create powered up versions of Spider-Man with spider armor and all that. So this is something that's from the comics, and it was established in the comic books. So I never really understood that. But in this, it would make sense that, Spider-Man being a part of the Avengers and being a friend with Tony Stark, and Tony Stark kind of taking him under his wing, because Tony Stark can probably see a lot of himself in Peter Parker, because Peter Parker is like a budding genius like Tony Stark is. So it makes sense that Peter Parker would take advantage of some of Tony Stark's technology for his Spider-Man costumes and things like that. So that for me never really was a problem. Where the other Spider-Man movies, it's different because they exist in a universe where you don't have the Avengers, you don't have Tony Stark. Where this Spider-Man, you do, so it's going to affect him. He's going to interplay with that universe. So that's a complaint I never really understood. So, but that issue does get fixed in this one. It kind of brings him back to basics at the end of the film. So if you did have a problem with it, that gets fixed in this movie as well. And the other thing is I want to talk about, now we all know that Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire shows up, so I want to talk about that. So one of the weaker links in the Spider-Man movies was Andrew Garfield. His movies were the weakest of them. And I never really bought into him as Peter Parker and Spider-Man in those films. That's another one, like the MJ character, that character gets fixed by this movie as well. When he shows up, and you can really see when everything's written well, you can really see that he really does a good job as Spider-Man, and you really buy him as Spider-Man in this movie. And it's kind of a shame that his Spider-Man movies were so poorly written, because seeing how he played Spider-Man in this film, he would have made, if given the proper material, would have made a really good Spider-Man. Now, on top of that, it was really awesome, too, to see Tobey Maguire come back again and play Spider-Man one more time. And seeing him come back in this movie, that moment where he comes back, it's probably would be up there in my top 5 favorite MCU moments of all time. It kind of reminded me of when they brought Luke Skywalker back for that episode of The Mandalorian, and how that was handled. So that, I really liked that as well. The other thing I liked about this movie was they brought Daredevil back into the MCU fold again. So you get to see Daredevil make an appearance in this movie. And that's one of the things I really liked about Marvel, was I really enjoyed that Daredevil Netflix series, especially the first season. I really liked it. And I'm glad that they're not just discarding that character, but they're bringing those characters back. So that was a really nice thing to see. And the other thing that I have to talk about is I really liked to see William Dafoe as the Green Goblin again, because he was such a good villain in that first Spider-Man film with Tobey Maguire. It was really awesome to see him come back, and he made for just a fantastic villain in this movie. And that's one of the strong points of Spider-Man as a character, is he always had a really good, strong rogues gallery. Now, one of the things that I did like about this movie, and it's something I like about the superhero genre in general, that makes this movie really fun, and that's the whole aspect of the multiverse. Because for whatever reason, it seems like superheroes and the whole comic book world is really suited to be able to tell these kind of crazy stories. And that's what I like about the whole concept of the multiverse, is you can tell these kinds of stories. You can have 3 different versions of Spider-Man show up in the same movie and team up together, which, I mean, that's really cool. I really like that whole idea, where, you could never do that with James Bond. Like, you could never do that in that world. You can never have a movie where, you bring back Sean Connery and Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton and, Daniel Craig, and they all have to team up in the same movie. You have all these different versions of James Bond in the same movie, and have to take on this group of villains. Like, that just wouldn't work for that. Like, you just couldn't do it. Like, it would just come off too ridiculous. But even though the concept is ridiculous, in the world of superheroes, it works. Somehow it just works. And you can get to tell these types of stories in these types of movies. And that's what I really like about the whole genre of superheroes and superhero movies. So I really liked that. So the only thing I thought was kind of a weak part in the movie as far as storytelling goes was, it seems like the whole idea of them getting investigated for the death of Mysterio, and there possibly being criminal charges put against Peter Parker and his friends, that seems to kind of just drop. Like, it just kind of disappears. As soon as the multiverse aspect shows up, that just kind of gets forgotten about. So that was kind of handled a little bit awkwardly. And now, one more thing I wanted to talk about, and I was actually really surprised that they did it in this movie, is they killed off Aunt May. She gets killed off by the Green Goblin in this movie, and she has a really awesome death scene in this one, and it's really moving, and I think it really pushes Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man forward as a character. So I really like that. And it kind of like brings the character back to basics too when the movie ends. That's another thing I liked. And a lot of people like that, because that was, as I talked about earlier, their complaints with the last movies that I didn't really have a problem with, but other people do. But overall, I have to say, I really enjoyed this MCU film, and I want to go see this one a second time. So that's everything I got to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I will see you at the next one. I'd like to say thank you to all of my subscribers. I appreciate you all in helping this channel grow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded.